Welcome to the Pipeliners Podcast, episode 49.
The Pipeliners Podcast, where professionals, Bubba geeks, and industry insiders share their knowledge and experience about technology, projects, and pipeline operations. And now your host, Russell Treat.
Thanks for listening to the Pipeliners Podcast. I appreciate you taking the time, and to show that appreciation, Pipeliners Podcast is giving away a customized Yeti tumbler to one listener each episode. This week, our winner is Cameron Levitt with Enterprise. Congratulations, Cameron. Your Yeti is on its way. To learn how you can win this signature prize pack, stick around to the end of the episode. This week on the Pipeliners Podcast, we have Yogi Schulz joining us to talk about pipeline safety management and the Canadian context for pipeline operations. So, Yogi, welcome to the Pipeliners Podcast.
Well, thank you, Russell. I appreciate the invitation. I look forward to having a discussion with you about pipeline issues.
Yeah, so, I think it's kind of neat that you reached out to me on LinkedIn, and we had an opportunity to talk a little bit. So I'm glad to have you. I think you're going to add some interesting context for the listeners, and hopefully we can all learn something today. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself and maybe how you got into pipelining.
Certainly, Russell. Our Corvelle Consulting organization works almost exclusively in Calgary, Canada. And one day the regulator here, the Alberta Energy Regulator, phoned and said, we need to make improvements in our processes for compliance assurance of pipelines. And since you and your organization helped us with a big problem on compliance assurance on measurement and reporting, we want to repeat that huge success and see if we can apply it to pipelines. And that's how I became introduced to the world of pipelines and helped the regulator pipeline engineers develop an improved process for compliance assurance of pipelines, mostly operated by producers as opposed to large pipeline companies.
Yeah, so I think that's kind of interesting. So you got into pipelining because you were in regulatory compliance for the production community, and then because of that work, got asked to move into pipelining.
Correct.
So
we barely knew how to spell pipelines before the regulator phone.
Well, I think that's kind of true of everybody in the pipeline business. It's all of us came here from somewhere, right?
Right.
I don't know where you would go to school and get a degree in, pipeline management.
I don't know of any place.
Yeah, I don't think it exists. So anyways, so what's the nature of regulatory compliance in Canada? How's it kind of structured? Maybe you kind of help the listeners with
Sure.
that aren't familiar with the Canadian market. I often say, Yogi, you might get a kick out of this. I often say that the U.S. and Canada are two countries separated by a common language.
I think that's a great synopsis, Russell. We think they're very similar. We drive on the same side of the road. We drive the same cars. We fly in the same airplanes. We go to the same McDonald's and other restaurants, but there are significant differences between the two countries.
Yeah, exactly. And those things begin to show up in particular in things like regulatory compliance, because the nature of, how the government is structured in Canada is different than how it's structured in the U.S. So maybe tell us a little bit about the nature of compliance in Canada.
Sure. At the federal level, we have the National Energy Board that has responsibility for large transmission pipelines, the ones that cross provincial borders. And every province has an energy regulator that's responsible for the gathering pipelines that typically don't cross any borders. And each of those provinces has developed a different regulatory regime, and with it, a different regime for licensing pipelines, monitoring pipelines, and auditing pipelines, and compliance assuring pipelines. In our case, we were asked to develop a compliance assurance methodology for the Alberta Energy Regulator. As you can tell, that's in the province of Alberta. That's where most of the oil and gas in Canada is located.
Right. So it's kind of, in the U.S., the states also have regulatory authority, but I believe that Canada actually has stronger state level or provincial level regulatory authority than federal in many cases. And in the U.S., it tends to be different. So in the U.S., the federal government kind of sets minimum standards, and then the states can do that and something more if they choose to. Where I think in Canada, it's kind of the opposite of that. Is the primary standard comes from the state. Do I understand that correctly?
You're right, Russell. It's quite different. In Canada, the provinces jealously guard their authority and sometimes are loath to accept advice from the federal government. And that's constitutional. It starts right back at the Constitution, where responsibility for the development of oil and gas is a provincial matter, not a federal matter. And the other huge difference between Canada and the United States is that the mineral rights are owned by the state or the crown, whereas, as you know, in the United States, most of the mineral rights are owned by the surface landowner.
Right.
That sets a huge different tone for the regulatory environment, because the surface landowner, who's upset that he's not getting any royalty income, at least wants to make sure that his or her land is protected from irresponsible behavior on the part of oil and gas operators.
Yeah. So does that mean that in Canada, oil and gas production is done kind of by eminent domain?
Well, a little bit. There's a lot of rules, mostly well spacing rules, that try to minimize the adverse impact on the surface landowner. And certainly pipelines have eminent domain in crossing lots of people's land the way it does in the United States. So yes, there's a distinct element of eminent domain even for the location of wells and production facilities.
Interesting. Yeah, so that's very, very different than the U.S.
Yeah.
And I would assume that because all this is generated from the state level, that the requirements can be somewhat different from province to province.
The requirements are different from province to province, and they're more voluminous, probably in all provinces. So, for example, in BC, British Columbia, there's a more finicky environmental aspect to locating wells and production facilities and pipelines. Alberta has the most exhaustive and most comprehensive regulations, but generally has a pro-business attitude. And Saskatchewan had an anti-business attitude for at least 30 years. In the last decade has had a change in government to a pro-business government, and had just a surge of investment in oil and gas, and is catching up in the development of their regulatory environment.
Well, we should probably also talk about national pipelines, because I know just like in the U.S., there's large pipelines or large companies that have pipelines that cross provincial borders. So how is that different, and who regulates those pipelines?
Well, at the national level, we have the National Energy Board that regulates those pipelines and holds hearings on applications to build new pipelines and approves them, and meaning or doesn't. And you don't get to build a national pipeline without a certificate of approval from the National Energy Board.
It's interesting. I mean, there are certainly a lot of similarities, and I think for a lot of people that don't know the differences between Canada and the U.S., the challenge is on the surface they look the same, but the minute you start really kind of digging in a little bit, boy, the details get really different really fast.
They do.
I know a lot of your work is focused on producers who happen to have pipelines. So how are producers who own pipelines uniquely challenged in Canada?
The challenge that producers face is they're under cost pressure, operating cost pressure. And I'm sure all of the producers in the U.S. are as are under a similar pressure. And the way that manifests itself is they want to be sure that for every dollar they spend, they see a real value statement. And sometimes on pipelines, because so much of it is out of sight and out of mind underground, there's a great temptation to underfund the risk analysis and risk assessment. And there's a temptation to think, hey, we did a good job installing this pipeline. We're doing a good job operating it, that's good enough. And if the regulator thinks we should do more, we respond to that quite cautiously. So that's the attitude of many producers. And that's one of the motivators why the regulator phoned us in 2012. They said some of the processes that are described in the regulation are being interpreted in ways that are quite expensive. How to maintain compliance, how to assess compliance. And it's causing some producers to not be compliant with those regulations. They'd rather skirt the regulation and not spend any money on this. So their challenge to us, the regulator's challenge to us, was come up with something cheaper, something that was still useful, still valuable to producers, but nonetheless demands less of them in terms of staff effort and dollars and consultants, that can become the basis for producers to pay attention to the risks that they have, to understand them better, and start to embark on a continuous improvement plan over many years, but nonetheless embark on that plan and move forward with it, as opposed to just ignore the whole issue and assume everything's fine because no disaster has occurred.
Yeah, that's I think that's a big challenge in pipelining, just kind of in general. Pipelines typically operate on pretty thin margins. There's lots of things that are competing for dollars in terms of operations and maintenance and all the things you have to do to operate a pipeline entity. And it's sometimes difficult to know how to optimally apply what limited resources you have. And I think, so before we kind of dive into that, I wanted to ask a little bit about, so I guess pipeline safety management is a required compliance task. Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. That's black and white. There's not a lot of debate about that being a requirement, but that's such a fuzzy high-level term. Mm-hmm. You can engage in a lot of rationalization around what that really means and what you need to do.
Yeah, that's actually what I wanted to unpack a little bit. So one of the questions that comes up is, what's the definition of a pipeline?
I don't think we have a lot of debates about that because the regulation makes it very clear where a pipeline starts and just ordinary piping inside a facility ends. So generally, there's acceptance of the definition of pipelines.
What is the definition of a pipeline in Canada?
There's two definitions, really. The gathering system, the pipelines that connect wells to producing facilities, such as batteries or gas plants, and transmission pipelines, those that connect producing facilities to refineries.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking this question, Yogi, I don't know if you're aware of this, but there's a new rulemaking that's working its way through PHMSA and its process on gathering, and there's changes coming in how gathering is defined, and there's generally been a distinction between what's considered a flow line and what's considered a gathering line, and I think what's going to happen in the U.S. is that what you're talking about in Canada, and this is kind of the reason I want to tee this up. I think what you're talking about in Canada about, producers have pipelines and those pipelines fall under regulatory domain. I think that's going to become even more true than it already is in the U.S., given this new rulemaking that's working its way through.
Yeah.
And there's some valid reasons for that. If you look at gas pipelines in the Utica Shale, there's 16-inch, 1400 PSI pipelines that are, called gathering lines.
Why?
Yeah, well, it's because of the way the definitions were written, and nobody contemplated doing gathering of, rich gas at those kind of pressures, because nobody contemplated, what was going to be the result of shale production when those rules were originally written. So anyways, I'm taking us down a little bit of a rabbit hole, but I think it's important for listeners to understand about, what we're talking about and the reality of the challenge that producers face, because pipeline is not really their core business.
Yeah, so you bring up a couple of different points, Russell. For us, the word flow line and the word gathering system in a pipeline context are essentially synonyms, although you hear the word flow line used more in an oil context and the word gathering system used more in a gas context. But you notice I'm not including any words like diameter, material, or pressure in these definitions, because that's all irrelevant to compliance. It doesn't really matter how high the pressure is, what the volume is, or how far the pipeline goes. If it fits into this role and is licensed by this kind of a regulator, then these are the rules that apply.
Yeah, again, that's a little different than the way it works in the U.S., but I think that's an important thing to realize is, and I would say too that I don't know if oil and gas is more regulated in Canada. It's certainly differently regulated in Canada. So
certainly, producers think it's more regulated, and again, that stems from the fact that the landowner has very little say in the matter here, and the landowner in the United States presumably is interested in that royalty check and less concerned about issues.
You would think that be true. I don't know that always be true.
Well, I'm expecting that landowners have developed a lot more sophistication over the last few decades and are upset now when oil companies leave a lot of garbage behind after the production is finished.
Well, there's a lot of work that goes on in the approach to development of assets that to minimize footprint, for sure.
Absolutely.
That's a big conversation going on in Colorado right now. So by the time this episode airs, it'll probably be after the vote in Colorado. I think the listeners would know which side of that issue I come down on. But so anyways, all I'm saying is you have some of the same issues, but the fact that the landowner owns the land and participates in the profits makes a difference. That's certainly true.
It changes the motivational model and the definition of what's more important and what's less important. It changes it a lot.
Right. I think that's very well said. It's very well said. So I want to talk to you about SLMS, because I know that that's the regulatory framework, if you will, in Canada. So can you tell me, kind of help the listeners understand what is SLMS and how is it applied in Canada?
SLMS is a regulatory requirement, and it's described a little bit conceptually in the regulations, and it's described in excruciating detail in many pages in the CSA Z662 standards document that talks about best practices for the design of pipelines, best practices for construction, commissioning, operation, maintenance, and eventual abandonment. So it tries very deliberately to cover the entire life cycle of pipelines, and it provides very detailed and exhaustive best practice guidance, ideas for pipeline operators and pipeline designers to consider as they manage their pipelines through the full life cycle.
It's the Canadian equivalent of the Pipeline Safety Act.
I think so.
Yeah. So that's a lot of stuff.
It is.
So how is it that you guys are helping producers do a better job of complying?
Well, the first thing that we tried, or our contribution to this is to help producers assess how well they're doing. And, as you said, it's a lot of material, and some producers find it intimidating or overwhelming or just altogether too much. And we often spend time saying to people, let's just not get too concerned about the volume of material. Let's just see what you've got in place already and where you have an opportunity to improve the operations that you have and thereby reduce the risk around your pipeline and improve your compliance. And that's where we come in. And some of our producers are aware of the audit practices of the regulator in British Columbia called OGC and the federal regulator NEB. And frankly, they're panicked by those audit practices because they think they're over the top in terms of the resource consumption of those audits. And they don't find they get a lot of value to help themselves improve their act from participating in those audits. But they do it because it's a part of the regulatory regime.
Boy, and that's, Yogi, you and I talked about that before we got on the microphones here together, and that's certainly been a theme in other conversations that I've had about compliance and performance. While they're not the same thing, when done well, they're first cousins. I
think so. You're on the right wavelength there, I think, Russell. So some of these producers look at us fairly skeptically initially, and then at the end of our process, they say, okay, now I really, really get it. And we end up with a very good list of what they're doing well, and we end up with an equally good list of what they agree they're not doing well. And that second list then becomes the basis for creating a plan to achieve remediation and continuous improvement. And it's happening at a scale and at a pace that doesn't scare anybody in terms of consumption of staff time or consumption of dollars.
Mm-hmm. So how do y'all go about doing this? I know, so you come out of a information technology background. I would assume you have a technology approach to accomplishing this. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we found that dialing in too much technology here is actually not helpful. So we are using fairly primitive technology, i.e. Excel, to run the whole process. What we emphasize is that you come up with very clear conclusions. It's either yes or no. And some of our other people, they make these general statements about the state of the universe in text, and the producers can't grapple with those, and they can't really know what to do next. So what we do is we have a lengthy interview with the people who are involved in pipeline operations, and we ask them very specific questions about various aspects of what they should be doing, what SLMS says they should be doing. And often they understand the question and they say, yes, we're doing that, or no, we're not doing that. And when they struggle to understand the question, we usually have a very good educational moment. I mean, if they're struggling to understand the question, you can already tell they're not doing it.
Right.
But that's okay. But we have an educational moment where we get to explain what the question means and what its implications are. And the conversation typically ends with them saying, yeah, we don't do that, but based on what I've just learned here, I see value in doing that. So I've been talking in generalities. Let me give you a very specific example, Russell. So we asked this question: how do you assure yourself that risk management, risk assessment, using the risk management procedure is being conducted? So, very simple question. Are you conducting risk management?
Well, it's a simple question, Yogi, in that it's easy to understand.
Yeah.
It may not be simple in terms of what it takes to answer it.
Absolutely. So the risk management procedure is the next question. After that question, we ask, how do you assure yourself that ongoing risk assessment is evident? Like, this isn't just something you do once a decade. It has to be some indication that you're doing it on an ongoing basis. And then the third question is, how do you assure yourself that the risk assessment procedure itself has been reviewed within the last year? Like, are you thinking about how you're doing this work? And then we ask, how do you assure yourself that the risk assessment results have been reviewed within the last year? So the issue is maybe you've done a risk assessment, but if nobody's looked at the results, who really cares?
Yeah.
And then we ask, how do you assure yourself that the risk assessment results produced procedure improvements where those were indicated? And then we finish it off by asking, how do you assure yourself that continuous improvement in risk assessment is evident? You'll know that there was that phrase, how do you assure yourself that? We use that phrase ad nauseum because that's really what it is. If you're in charge of this, how do you really know that something is happening, something exists? If it's simply a case of Joe's a good guy and I trust him, that doesn't cut it. We can all agree that Joe is a good guy and we should trust him, but how do we know he's really doing some kind of work?
Yeah.
And so we say, okay, Joe, you did a risk assessment. Did you write a report about that? He said, no, I just scribbled a bunch of things in the logbook. Then I ask, well, do we consider that adequate? Obviously, I don't. And people kind of look at the floor and say, no, that doesn't cut it. And then we agree that the conclusion is not effective. Joe needs to be doing more.
Right. Well, I think that's really the way you frame that. I think is really, really interesting because it's the whole phrase. How do you ensure? You know, it's really and really that's a very kind of, to me, that's kind of a creative way of asking a little bit of a different question, which is, are you moving the needle?
Yeah.
Are you actually getting better, safer, more effective, or not?
We think that's a hugely important question. Are you moving the needle? And if people just kind of shrug at you and say, yeah, I think I have good people, I think we are, well, that's not evidence. That's somebody's opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. How do you know? How do you know you're moving the needle? And a lot of these things are, you know, as I'm sure you well know, that this kind of thing can get complicated real fast. And we as human beings tend to make things more complicated than they need to be. If we could set aside egos and the need to perform, yes, no gets real easy. But, you know, the reality of it is we are humans and we are organizations and we do want to do a good job. And, you know, I believe that people in our business, you know, are really aware of the need to do good jobs. You know, they're aware of the need for safety and so forth. But, you know, it's interesting. I think this is very interesting. So we're kind of coming to the end of our time. I want to kind of draw maybe some conclusions.
Can I hit you with one more item first?
Yes, absolutely.
So we emphasize a collaborative approach between us and the staff of the producer. Mostly when you hear the word audit, you immediately click into an adversarial mode between the auditor and the auditee. And we think it's hugely important to not go there. We try to set a tone and an approach that this whole thing is very collaborative. We're interested in your answers. We're not going to roll our eyes, and we're not going to challenge the consensus among the staff of the producer. If you guys think something is working, we accept that. And that makes us more effective and sets the right tone and gets everybody thinking positively about how to get better in the future. Right. I'm reminded of a joke that I was told when I was in the Air Force. You know, in the Air Force, there's an inspector general, and the inspector general goes around and he audits, you know, various organizations. And then you also have the base commander, who's the guy who, you know, is in charge of running the base. And I was once told that the two biggest lies in the Air Force are when the IG gets off the plane and says, we're here to help,
and when the base commander shakes his hand and says, "We're glad to see you."
Yeah.
And
right.
We'd like for that to actually be true. That we're actually collaboratively trying to get better as an industry. That's what this is all about.
At the risk of boasting, we like to think that those two statements are in fact true once the staff of a given producer have completed our self-assessment process with us. And they don't go to the vice president after we're shown to the door and whisper in his ear and say, "Don't ever invite those idiots into our office again." we don't think that happens, and we're proud of the fact that it doesn't.
I think you've laid out a process and a way of approaching this that can be very constructive. And I think, what I like to do around the end of a lot of these episodes is kind of, what are my 3 key takeaways? And I'm noodling on what that might be. So I think one takeaway here is that the idea that the answer is either yes or no versus I'm going to give myself a score, that actually simplifies and clarifies the process. I think that's a pretty powerful idea.
We think it is. And if you look at pipeline.sms.org and look at their evaluation Excel spreadsheet, they try to rank things between 1 and 5. And we think that's a horrible idea because people always want to debate whether we're a 2, a 3, or a 4. And all that does is build conflict, not harmony.
Well, I think in larger pipeline operations, like the large, multi-state transmission lines, that is a more valid way of understanding the nature of my current level of performance.
Okay.
And it's helpful in terms of understanding how to apply resources, because in a company whose core business is pipelining, they're doing all of that. The question is, how effective are we doing it? Versus in a smaller operator, the issue is more, am I doing it or not?
I agree with the difference you're referring to between pipeline companies and oil companies that have pipelines.
Yeah, and SMS is written as a standard for people whose core business is pipeline. So that's my first key takeaway. I think for the smaller guy who's struggling with it, kind of a digital answer, yes, no, I think that's really powerful. I think the other really creative thing you're doing and the way you're asking your questions, kind of my second key takeaway, is this phrase, how do you assure yourself that?
Right.
That is a really powerful concept. In fact, I might co-opt that and train some people here to say that when we do similar kind of work for our customers.
So we'd love to have you walk away, Russell, thinking we invented that. But the reality is what we did is we unabashedly stole that from the SOX auditors. They're the ones who really, when SOX came into being a decade or two ago, they're the ones who invented that.
Right. And then I think the third takeaway here is that, and this is kind of a conclusion I'm coming to as we're wrapping up the conversation, is that the nature of how you do this needs to be kind of appropriate to the kind of operation you have. So what's appropriate for a small producer that has pipelines that's trying to, demonstrate I'm moving the needle in a good direction is very different than what a large pipeline operator might need to do.
Correct, Russell.
While the details might be the same, the approach might need to be materially different. And I think that's an important takeaway in this conversation as well. So
to build on that, we're very successful by getting all the pipeline people in a room for one day, and it's usually just 5 or 6 people, and we can get through the whole process in one business day. Well, you can't do that with a national pipeline organization.
No.
Because they have a room full or a building full of people who do these things.
That's right. It's a much more complicated thing. Yogi, this has been really good. I've certainly learned some things here and enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate you coming on and being a guest, and I think we'd like to have you back and talk about some of these other issues in more detail at some point in the future. So thanks for joining us.
Well, I appreciate you giving us the opportunity to chat with you and build what I hope will be a useful podcast for your audience. Thank you very much.
So if our listeners wanted to reach out and get in touch with you, what's the best way to do that?
Well, the easiest way is just to type my name into Google, Yogi Schulz, Schulz, and you'll get my email address and you'll get to our website, and we'd be pleased to start a discussion.
Awesome. Thanks again, Yogi.
Great to chat with you, Russell. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of the Pipeliners podcast and our conversation with Yogi Schulz. Just a reminder before you go, you should register to win our customized Pipeliners podcast Yeti tumbler. Simply visit pipelinerspodcast.com/win to enter yourself in the drawing. If you would like to support the podcast, please leave us a review on your smart device podcast application. You can find instructions at pipelinerspodcast.com. If you have ideas, questions, or topics you would be interested in, please let us know on the Contact Us page at pipelinerspodcast.com or reach out to me on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you next week.